Recording in progress.
That sounds really ominous, but it's not, I promise. Welcome everyone to the Zoom, and those of you who are live, welcome to you too. The program is Corporate Complicity in the Holocaust, German Big Business in the Nazi Era. We do have some speakers. I am going to just ask you to fill out some of those programming slips that are in the back before you leave. That's all I have. I'm going to turn it right over to Gene Van Zant, and he will introduce our main speaker and presenter.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Good evening. Let's see. Kelly, could you mute? There we go. My name is Gene Van Zant, and I am a professor of U.S. history at Northwest Arkansas Community College in Bentonville, Arkansas. Some of you are aware that a national survey in 2020 found that basic knowledge of the Holocaust among young adults across the United States was poor. And I'm sad to tell you that Arkansas ranked dead last in terms of ranking the states. When that was publicized, it led to the state of Arkansas requiring that the Holocaust be taught specifically in K through 12 schools. And also it led to the formation at our community college of what we call the Northwest Arkansas Holocaust Awareness Project. So starting in 2021, every semester we've had an event, either a speaker, a film, even a Holocaust survivor. And so we're very pleased tonight to have another one of those and to be co-hosting it with the Fayetteville Public Library, one of my favorite libraries in the world. And we're very happy to have Dr. Peter Hayes with us tonight, speaking on corporate complicity in the Holocaust, German big business in the Nazi era. Dr. Hayes is Professor Emeritus of History at Northwestern University and former chair of the Academic Committee of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. He is one of the foremost scholars of the Holocaust in general, and for the specific topic tonight, the role played by German businesses, especially the large industrial firms, with regard to the Holocaust. He is the author of over a dozen books, including one that we used a couple years ago as a book discussion book, this one on why explaining the Holocaust. His most recent book I've got here with me, Profits and Persecution, German Big Business in the Nazi Economy and Holocaust. Great book, and it's very accessible. It's not, from the title you might think it was 1,000 pages, but it's very accessible, I think, to non-specialists in the subject. After his presentation, we will have some time for questions that he will address, and when it gets to that time, you can write questions in the comments or over your microphone. And now, Dr. Peter Hayes.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try to share my screen and see if the technology works. I think it did. You should all be able to see that. Thank you for coming. Thank you for the invitation. This book is actually the summary of 50 years of research. I started out as a German historian in 1973, and by 1975, I had latched on to the history of German corporations in the Nazi era, and I've kept moving in and out of that field ever since, and this was intended as the book that would more or less summarize what I think I have learned in that 50 years. As you just heard, I hope it's accessible, but what it certainly is a lot shorter than I expected it to be. It's under 200 pages, and so that contributes, I hope, to the accessibility. Now, historians often stress the open-endedness of the stories they tell, the contingency of events that could have gone in multiple directions had the people taking part made different choices. In a sense, my talk today both conforms to this sort of narrative and departs from it, without questioning the general principle of indeterminacy, I want to suggest that the key switches were thrown very early in the development of German corporate collaboration in the persecution and murder of the Jews. Probably in the first 6 months of Nazi rule, surely within the first 18 months, and well before the regime's principal policymakers had decided what that collaboration would require. Barring a change in the erratic but inexorable momentum of Nazi government policy toward ever greater viciousness, these switches were irreversible. After putting up an only half-hearted and self-serving defense of some German Jews, while many others were losing positions and property during these initial months of Nazi rule, the leaders of the nation's largest corporations simply had no persuasive, let alone safe grounds to dissent later. As the Reich's policies radicalized, firms discerned ever-mounting reasons to take advantage of developments. In other words, the slippery slope started fast and proved steep. In view of the 2024 election results in the United States, it is a timely, worrying, and potentially instructive story. The slope tipped downward even before Adolf Hitler's appointment as Chancellor of Germany in January 1933, since a fateful ambivalence regarding anti-Semitism already pervaded the upper reaches of Germany's largest corporations. On the one hand, unlike many fervent Nazis, few executives resented Jews as economic competitors or considered the commanding heights of the German economy Jewified. The numerical presence of Jews on the managing and supervisory boards of the country's 90 most highly capitalized firms had dropped by almost 1/3 between 1907 and 1927. On the boards of the 300 largest non-financial firms in Germany, that presence fell by almost another third during just the following 5 years. By 1932, almost 2/3 of these 300 leading firms had no Jews at all in senior positions. Multiple causes accounted for the downward trend. Mortality among senior industrialists with no suitable heirs or Jewish successors, mismanagement by some unsuitable inheritors, mergers in the later 1920s that absorbed many Jewish-owned firms into publicly traded entities, resignations during the upheaval of the Depression, and government decrees that shrank the size of corporate boards and the number on which any individual could serve simultaneously. Anti-Semitism appears to have played a role in one significant case, that of the disappearance of Jews from the managing board of the chemical giant IG Farben between 1925 and 1932, but not in others. After all, many of the remaining Jews were that by heritage only, and second or third generation converts to Christianity. Few were regarded as alien in any significant sense, and virtually none of these Jews took political positions significantly different from those of their Gentile colleagues. Most contemporary or retrospective accounts suggest that anti-Semitism did not quite stop at the boardroom doors, but its grasp was relatively weak inside the threshold. Nonetheless, a particular mix of anti-Semitic aversions persisted among corporate leaders. It thrived not on animosity or rivalry toward Jews one knew, but on distaste for those perceived from a distance. Two such groups aroused particular ire. First, the roughly 100,000 traditionalist Jews from Eastern Europe, many of whom had immigrated to Germany during the period of lax border controls during and shortly after World War I. They now constituted 20% of the German Jewish population, appeared uninterested in assimilation, and aroused fears of incursion by the backward and unwashed East. Second, the numerous Jewish intellectuals who criticized capitalism from prominent positions in culture and journalism, and thus offended industrialists' self-esteem. What you see here are pictures of three of them: Ernst Toller, who was a very prominent novelist of the 1920s, Max Reinhardt, who was the most famous theater director in Germany, and Theodor Wolff, who was the editor of the Berliner Tageblatt, which was not quite the New York Times of Germany in those days, but pretty close. Uneasy with attacks on decent and accomplished Jews like themselves, but irritated by these other Jews, many corporate leaders gravitated toward a specious middle ground in policy, a fateful ambivalence typified by the diaries and papers of Fritz Rössler, the man you see here on the left. He was the supervisory board chair at Degussa, a major inorganic chemicals company in Frankfurt, whose successor nowadays is called Evonik. Rössler expressed opposition to infringements on the livelihood and legal status of long-resident Jewish fellow citizens, but at the same time support for measures that would, as he put it, push back Jews' cultural influence, including by imposing quotas on their admission to universities and professional schools, what was called the numerus clausus. Hitler, Goering, and other leading Nazis indulged this sort of distinction drawing prior to 1933 by echoing it or avoiding the subject of Jews altogether when meeting with big business leaders, even as Nazi newspapers and marauding stormtroopers threatened a much more sweeping assault. As a result, when Hitler came to power, most of the leaders of German big business underestimated the threat anti-Semitism posed to Jews, but already had ruled out a categorical defense of them. The fateful consequence of this weakness of anti-Semitism at the top of the corporate world became apparent swiftly during the spring of 1933, as the Nazi movement demonstrated its lack of deference to the nation's magnates and their scruples. At a gathering of some 24 high-ranking executives on February 20th in Berlin, to which Goering had attracted them with the promise that, quote, the Reich Chancellor will explain his policies, unquote, Hitler made clear that he was not interested in discussing economic issues, but rather he was interested in shaking down those assembled for monetary contributions to his current election campaign. His method was to announce that the Nazis had no intention of relinquishing power, regardless of the outcome of the voting. So the industrialist choice was between financing Hitler's win or experiencing civil war if he lost. He and Goering then departed, leaving the man you see here on the right, Hjalmar Schacht, a former and future head of the German National Bank, to collect their monetary pledges, which ultimately amounted to 3 million marks. 2 weeks later, the Nazis manipulated the ground rules and won 44% of the vote, and their national allies another 8%. Their qualified victory set off numerous wildcat actions by Nazi party fanatics in factories all across the country. As non-Nazi workers' representatives were compelled to resign in favor of politically acceptable figures, reduce the numbers of Jewish employees, and pressure mounted on companies to dismiss Jewish managers, reduce the numbers of Jewish employees, and replace them with unemployed Nazi party members. This sort of agitation culminated in April 1933, during and following the infamous party-organized boycott of Jewish shops and offices. Often overlooked is another event on that day: the appearance of the man you see here on the left, Otto Wagner, at the time the leader of the Nazi Party's Economic Policy Office. He appeared at the offices of the National Association of German Industry. He demanded the dismissal of two of the organization's business managers, their replacement by two government-approved appointees, and the removal of all Jews from its governing board. As it happened, the association's president, this man, Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach, was meeting at that very moment with Hitler. And when he learned later that day of the demands, he entreated the Führer to rescind them. Adolf Hitler said no 2 days later. Krupp caved in over the protests of several other board members, whom he silenced by threatening to resign. This was the first fateful turning point, as German big business capitulated to an entirely illegal demand, backed only by naked political power, and it occurred only 2 months after Hitler came into office. Thereafter, Krupp clung to what one historian has called a strategy of ingratiation. I prefer the word appeasement, hoping to maintain industry's influence over government economic policy by cooperating with the regime's political goals. Most of German big business fell in line behind this ultimately futile policy because they could not agree on an alternative and because they liked other Nazi policies, such as the smashing of the trade unions. But both lack of conviction about defending Jews and fear of personal consequences contributed to the inertia. The mixed feelings that many executives harbored toward Jews meant that the most they could expect from the corporate world, at least in public, was the sort of temporizing defense that this man, Carl Friedrich von Siemens, who is the picture on the right, I hope you can see that, that Carl Friedrich von Siemens, who was the head of the firm that still exists that has his family name, offered in early April. He expressed, quote, "the sincerest sympathy to the German Jews who are deeply rooted in our fatherland, and the hope that this period of exaggerated anti-Semitism will soon belong to history," unquote. But he also endorsed the arrest of what he called Edelbolschewisten, term that roughly translates cultured communists, including what he said was, quote, "a very large percentage of Jews, primarily newly immigrated ones," unquote. He then chided native-born German Jews for having failed to distance themselves sufficiently from the leftist politics of, quote, "their racial comrades," unquote, and advocated the reduction of the share of Jews among lawyers and physicians in Germany, quote, "to a healthy proportion that approximates the population mix," unquote. In person, as late as May 1933, I'm sorry, I lost my place there. In person, as late as May 1933, a few executives, notably Karl Bosch of IG Farben, who's on the left here, and Hans Walz of the Robert Bosch Corporation, who's on the right, tried to persuade Hitler and other leading Nazis that persecuting Jews would damage Germany, but to no avail. A behind-the-scenes effort from May to August to draft a memo for the economics ministry to the same effect, in which Karl Bosch, Krupp, and Siemens took part, resulted in a wan document that endorsed the goal, quote, "of bringing the views of the national government to fulfillment," unquote, but argued for proceeding slowly and avoiding economic disruption. The toothless text quickly became a dead letter. The second secret behind the general acceptance of Krupp's policy was the regime's intimidation of several highly visible corporate leaders during the spring of 1933. Paul Reusch, the head of a mining and machinery conglomerate and a dominant voice among German industrialists in the waning days of the Weimar Republic, owned a newspaper in Munich that the Nazis wished to control. Between March and May 1933, Nazi officials dismissed the editors and appointed new ones, confiscated Reusch's stockholding, and arrested his protesting lawyers, making their release conditional upon acceptance of the expropriation. Reusch not only gave in, but henceforth lined up behind Krupp's course, which he had initially opposed. Simultaneously, two other magnates, Philipp Reimsma, the man in the middle here, head and part owner of Germany's largest cigarette producers, and Günther Quandt, the man on the right, who had the same status as the leading producer of batteries, found themselves being investigated by the Prussian Justice Ministry for alleged instances of corruption and bribery during the preceding democratic regime. Reimsma avoided arrest, but several of his leading managers did not, and he was subjected to attacks in the press and calls for his removal that came to an end only when he paid Hermann Göring a bribe of 3 million marks. Quandt's torture lasted longer and cost more. He and his chief subordinates were arrested, and a Nazi commissar took over his plants for several months. Quandt obtained release only by paying a bail that came, according to a headline from the New York Times, this is how much attention this case attracted, a bail that came to over 1 million US dollars. He remained embroiled in expensive legal proceedings for another 2 years. Meanwhile, both men had got the intended message. Reimsma and Quandt aligned themselves closely with the regime's policies henceforth, and Quandt became particularly active in driving Jews out of German economic positions. By the summer of 1933, the Nazi regime had shown Germany's corporate bigwigs who was horse and who was rider, as the German expression goes. The administration of this lesson involved passing threats to executives like Reusch, Reimsma, and Quandt, but lasting consequences for many Jewish firm owners, board members, managers, and even rank and file employees. They fell victim to a massive first purge that their Gentile colleagues saw as merely the price of a working relationship with the new Nazi government. In the country's 300 leading industrial firms, 1/3 of the remaining Jewish managing directors and 1/4 of the supervisory directors, as of January 1933, lost their posts in the first half of that year alone. By mid-1934, the respective figures came to 57% and 50%. And for firms based in Berlin, almost 2/3 and more than 1/2. Changes of ownership were less extensive at this early stage, but still significant, especially in commercial fields on which the Nazis long had been fixated: department and chain stores, newspapers and book publishing, state-owned industries and utilities, suppliers to the military, government offices, and the National Railroad. Both with respect to directorships and ownerships, some major firms acted even before the regime applied pressure, exercising what the Germans call anticipatory obedience. The Deutsche Bank quickly dismissed 2 Jewish managing board members, even though Schacht told their colleagues that this was not necessary. The Dresdner Bank, the number 2 bank in Germany at the time, hired Erich Niemann, one of Goering's flying mates during World War II, to cajole the Jewish owners of firms tied to the bank to sell out before their companies lost value. In other words, from the beginning of Nazi rule, most leading German executives regarded the Nazi onslaught on the Jews strictly through the lens of self-interest, personal or corporate. If individual managers or clients or suppliers were vital, firms tried to retain them as long as that was the case. If they were expendable, then one accepted what were called, quote, the requirements of the prevailing conditions, unquote, and extended at most help in finding jobs abroad or positive letters of recommendation, normal severance terms, and purchase prices that corresponded to the market value of whatever company was being acquired. But that value usually had been reduced, at first by the after effects of the Depression, and later by the increasing desperation of the sellers to get out of Germany. Because the induced flight of Jewish property owners presented German big business with numerous opportunities to shelter rising profits, expand market shares, diversify, and vertically or horizontally integrate. The competition to cash in on Jews' misfortune picked up steadily. By 1937, niceties were falling away as regional Nazi economic advisors increasingly prompted sales and influenced prices, and banks and creditors shifted from fearing the loss of Jewish owners' expertise to fearing their loss of business and thus their ability to repay. Lenders thus tipped from being sustainers of Jewish enterprises to underminers of them. Meanwhile, firms began to take advantage of provisions that allowed them to reduce Jews' pension payments. The now defunct Dresdner Bank emerged as a pace-setter in brokering property transfers and reneging on its commitments to Jewish former employees who numbered in the hundreds. The self-interest in persecution operated particularly powerfully within the macroeconomic context that Nazism created. Purging and dispossessing Jews wasn't just about gaining what they had, but also about pleasing the regime. In the second half of the 1930s, 2/3 of the annual growth of the German economy stemmed from state expenditures on armaments or substitutes for imports. The nation was a monopsony, an economy dominated by one buyer, and the German corporate world was dependent on and addicted to government contracts. Increasingly, a precondition for receiving those contracts was active cooperation in making Germany Judenrein, free of Jews. At the turn of 1937-38, the Nazi regime changed its policy from encouraging the removal of Jews from German economic life to enforcing it. The economics ministry issued a series of decrees withdrawing access to raw materials, foreign exchange, and government contracts from any firm with a Jewish board member or senior manager, or in which Jews owned more than 25% of the stock. Since the withdrawal of those things meant the death of any firm that met the criteria, the decrees set in motion a complete purge of the few Jews remaining in board positions and a massive sell-off of Jewish shareholdings at increasingly party-dictated prices. The Nazi state conducted a census of Jews' assets in April 1938, and in the aftermath of the Kristallnacht pogrom of November, began insisting upon the monetization of those assets, the depositing of the money in consolidated bank accounts to which the owners had only limited access, and then began outright confiscating those funds. Corporations now became even more active and indispensable agents of persecution than previously. The major insurance firms paid the cash value of Jews' life insurance policies into those partially blocked accounts. Eduard Hilgard, the head of Allianz, the largest of these insurance firms, persuaded Nazi leaders that his company did not need to pay some 50 million Reichsmark in Jews' fire and damage claims from the pogrom. And this is an illustration of what they were claiming the money for. How did he do this? He made the factually outrageous but politically convenient claim that the Jews had provoked the destruction. And this persuaded the Nazis that he could be allowed not to repay his policyholders. Degussa, the company I mentioned earlier, converted the precious metals-bearing objects that Jews had to hand over to state pawnshops into bars of gold for the German National Bank and bars of silver for industrial use. Meanwhile, the Deutsche, Dresdner, and Commerzbanks loaned much of the capital needed for corporate takeovers and took in fees for brokering them. And the same financial institutions collected, itemized, and administered Jews' assets, restricted Jews' access to those assets, and then transferred the sums exacted by the Nazi state to the finance ministry. Indicative of the degree to which corporate leaders and their firms had become constituent parts of the apparatus of persecution by early 1939 is the fact that of the activities I just described, only Hilgart's was highly profitable. Even the brokering of property transfers turned out to be a low-margin business for banks because more assets were lost through the mass liquidation of firms than gained on a small number of high-commission sales. But companies felt compelled to compete, not only for the assets the regime threw up for grabs, but also and sometimes primarily for political favor and the future preferences and rewards that that favor might bring. What the historian Neil Gregor has called the normalization of barbarism among corporate policymakers became especially apparent regarding Jews' assets in the annexed regions of Austria and the Sudetenland and the subjugated protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia during the run-up to World War II. Once more, the now defunct Dresdner Bank was in the vanguard, gobbling up the lion's share of available financial subsidiaries and serving as the agent of corporations that belonged to the Nazi state, such as the Reichswerke Hermann Göring, or cultivated close ties to it, including Mannesmann Steel. By now, even firms that largely had refrained from takeovers within Germany, such as IG Farben and Schering, the famous pharmaceuticals company, plunged in as a means of beating out competitors. The acquirers consistently regarded it as none of their business that the Nazi state then generally stripped the former owners of most of the sales proceeds, however meager. Given this record, by the time World War II began, corporations, like virtually all other German institutions, were virtually pre-programmed to participate in future Nazi crimes. In fact, most of them already were so implicated in plunder and persecution that there was no turning back. Degussa had agreed to smelt the precious metals the Reich extorted from German Jews in 1939. How could it then refuse to do the like for the precious metals German bureaucrats squeezed from the Jews of Łódź in 1940, or even express reservations about purifying the metals that the SS later delivered to the National Bank from camps and shooting sites in occupied Poland and further east? The Deutsche, Dresdner, and Commerzbanks had brokered and been party to numerous property transfers in Germany and served as transmission belts that collected, monetized, and steadily transferred Jews' wealth to the German state. On what basis, then, would these institutions and their affiliates in occupied countries shun similar activities or cease to perform them once deportations began? Leading German manufacturers had pursued Jewish-owned enterprises in Austria, the Sudetenland, and the Czech provinces, especially prospective competitors and/or former business partners. Why would these enterprises then refrain from tempting acquisitions in the expanding German Empire? Allianz had begun insuring SS-owned factories at Dachau, and Degussa's Degesch subsidiary had started supplying Sachsenhausen with Zyklon to fumigate clothing in 1940. Why would they withhold these services from new camps farther east later? With the power and wealth of Himmler's SS obviously on the rise in wartime, the benefits of good working relations with its leadership were too great to forego for firms or individual executives jockeying for advantage, and the risks of poor ties too great to assume. As a result, while first German rhetoric and then German actions turned toward annihilation as the final solution to the Jewish question, the extent of German corporate participation in the escalating criminality became largely a function of what the government asked corporations to do. When and where the government permitted or called for significant corporate involvement, the competitive ambitions of senior executives and their enterprises generally guaranteed its availability. When and where the regime saw reason to restrain corporate ambitions, the role of German big business in the Holocaust proved less than many firms wished. Contrary to popular perception, corporate takeovers of Jewish-owned property in occupied countries were one of the spheres in which the acquisitive ambitions of big German firms were often disappointed. But when the SS asked, corporations treated it as a fitting business partner and became willing enablers of the Holocaust. The large commercial banks and their subsidiaries in occupied regions extended lines of credit to the SS and its offshoots and accepted massive deposits from them, which consisted almost entirely of sums extorted or plundered from Jews before or during their deportation. In Prague, the largest single depositor to the Dresdner Bank's affiliate was the SS Central Office for Jewish Emigration, which confiscated most of the assets of Czech Jewry. At the Deutsche Bank's subsidiary in the same city, the largest depositor was the Jewish administration of the Theresienstadt Transit Ghetto, which you see two pictures of, one overhead and one is a street scene. And this was the ghetto to which privileged Jews had to assign their assets before being allowed to spend a short time in this way station on the road to death. In Krakow, about half of the cash proceeds of Operation Reinhard, the pillaging and murder of Polish Jewry, landed in the vaults of another Dresdner Bank subsidiary. Along with the banks, Germany's leading precious metals processors and insurance firms actively sought out the SS's business. Determined to preserve its market leadership, Degussa unquestioningly accepted various forms of gold gathered by the SS, especially from the occupied East and the Netherlands, and refined it into some 5 metric tons of pure and saleable gold, some of which the bank peddled at a substantial profit on the open market in Istanbul. Allianz Insurance agreed to cover the shipments in both directions, from the SS to Degussa, and from it to the banks and then to Turkey. Instrumental in turning Jews' assets to the Nazi state's advantage, large German firms were also vital to the realization of the largest and most murderous death camp, namely Auschwitz. In fact, the place might never have acquired that dreadful status, but for 2 related decisions on the part of I.G. Farben's leaders in early 1941. The first decision was to build a giant synthetic fuel and rubber factory 7 kilometers east of the camp at a place called Monowitz. And second, to trade building materials destined for that project to the SS in return for gravel and laborers from the small concentration camp for Polish political prisoners that had been established the year before. The first decision to build the factory created an appetite for labor that alerted Himmler to revenue-generating possibilities in the region. The second decision allowed the SS to add an extra floor to nearly all the pre-existing barracks that constituted the fledgling concentration camp, and thus to greatly increase the number of inmates. When plans emerged later in the year to build a companion camp at Birkenau, and then early in 1942 to construct 4 large buildings containing gas chambers and crematoria there, the construction firm selected was one in which the Dresdner Bank was the largest shareholder and lender. AEG, a company founded and for a long time led by members of the Jewish Rathenau family, provided the electric circuitry in these buildings. Once again, Allianz extended coverage for the workshops at the original camp and the Farben factory. The Deutsche Bank's branch at the nearby city of Katowice loaned the SS 2 million Reichsmark, mostly for Birkenau, and an equal sum to Farben for its construction project. Having helped bring Auschwitz-Birkenau to life, I.G. Farben also aided the camp in producing death. The giant chemicals combine was part owner in a secondary capacity to its partner Degussa in a company called Degesh. It controlled the production of Zyklon, a vaporizing pesticide that in 1941 became the principal murder weapon at Auschwitz-Birkenau. No known evidence establishes that the representatives of Farben on the board of Degesh knew of the use of the product for gassing. But the business manager of Degesh, who was on Degussa's payroll, and the principal owner of the firm that actually sold the Zyklon to the SS, both certainly did know, and they chose to continue delivering the substance. Farben's second connection to the death toll at Auschwitz was more demonstrable and direct. It involved supplying SS doctors at Auschwitz and other concentration camps with sulfa drugs and vaccines designed to combat dysentery, gonorrhea, tuberculosis, and typhus. These were then tested for efficacy and tolerability on inmates. In some of these experiments, half of the prisoners treated as guinea pigs died, but the total number of victims is unknown. Still a third way in which Farben contributed to the mortality rate at Auschwitz was the firm's exploitation of thousands of inmate slave laborers at its nearby factory and coal mines. The best estimates of the death toll vary between 13,000 and 28,000 prior to the evacuation of the site in January 1945. By that time, the practice of putting camp prisoners to work in German industry had become widespread, including more than 700,000 people spread among enterprises deemed vital to the German war effort. Farben's deal with Auschwitz for labor in early 1941 actually blazed a trail in this regard. Until then, only the construction firm Philipp Holtzmann had made extensive use of ghetto or camp inmates, they put it to work on building a highway from Berlin to Łódź in 1940. But Farben's agreement with the SS still conformed to the general SS preference for locating factories near camps, not camps near factories. Volkswagen broke this taboo later in 1941 by arguing successfully for establishing a camp at its factory in Wolfsburg for inmates to work building a plant to make aluminum. These arrangements remained unusual until late 1943, when Albert Speer, the armaments minister, and Heinrich Himmler of the SS concluded that the Reich's labor shortage was so acute that Jewish camp inmates had to be put to work in multiple German factories, along with numerous non-Jews that were being rounded up from across occupied Europe. Most industrial leaders gratefully accepted the workers thus offered, concluding that they were indispensable to maintaining or increasing output, given the massive military call-ups of industrial workers and the already high rate of German female employment. The tunnel vision that pervaded industrial participation in the Holocaust especially characterized the readiness of German industry to exploit inmate labor during World War II. It amounted to a willingness to walk over corpses, which is the literal translation of the German equivalent of to stop at nothing. For the employment of inmate labor occurred on terms that contained perverse incentives. The SS charged a fee per inmate per day that in many cases exceeded what a German civilian laborer, especially a construction worker, would have been paid if such a laborer had been available. Even when this was not the case, the relatively low productivity of inexperienced inmates offset any savings on compensation. As a result, employers sought to economize on food and housing, to drive prisoners excessively hard, and to work them long hours, at least so long as replacements were available for those who fell by the wayside. In other words, the use of so-called slave laborers became a process in which firms and their leaders reduced camp inmates to the status of a factor of production that could be used up like so many pieces of coal. Of the 1.1 million camp inmates put to work, about half for government projects like building the bunkers along the Atlantic coast and the underground factories like those that made the V-2 rockets, and about the other half for firms that produced arms and vital materials. Of this total of 1.1 million, roughly half perished. Participation in this crazed process, including in the massive efforts in 1944-45 to bury factories underground in order to save equipment and production lines from bombing. All this was fostered by executives' real fears of ouster, arrest, and execution. In 1942 alone, Paul Reusch, the man you saw very early in the talk a picture of, was forced out of the leadership of his company, as was Ernst Pönsken, who headed the United Steel, the largest private firm in Germany, while the regime also succeeded in removing or disempowering all the top executives of the nation's 5 leading aircraft makers, BMW, Heinkel, Messerschmitt, Junkers, and Focke-Wulf. In 1943, 2 directors of Deutsche Bank branches, Hermann Köhler in Stuttgart and Georg Mieter, whose picture you see here in Silesia. These 2 men were denounced to the Gestapo by people who overheard them making disparaging remarks about Nazism and or its leaders. Not only were they both condemned to death that fall, but the Nazi national newspaper, the Völkische Beobachter, published an article that made a public example of Mieter. So his punishment, his offense and his punishment were well known. Around the same time, a man named Wilhelm Ricken, the head of the Rhenish-Westphalian electricity works, was charged with, quote, undermining the fighting spirit. That's what this word here means in translation. And of undermining the nation for having predicted Germany's impending defeat to his colleagues. He was executed in May 1944, and his death is recorded today on this piece of brass. It's called a Stolperstein, a stumbling stone, which is placed on the sidewalk in front of his last residence in the city of Essen. Finally, in the last stages of the war, the regime repeatedly scapegoated corporate leaders for breakdowns in output or air defenses by alleging sabotage. Rudolf Blom, you see here on the right, who was the head of his family's shipbuilding firm, Erich Zipprich, the chief engineer at BMW, and 2 leaders of submarine manufacturers all faced such charges. Throughout the descent of German corporate conduct, from the abandonment of Jewish colleagues in 1933, through profiting off Jews' dispossession and murder, to working Jews to death, the leading executives embodied the thoughtlessness, the indifference to people on the receiving end of their deeds that Hannah Arendt defined as the banality of evil. Indeed, they embodied it far more accurately than the sort of man to which she applied the term, Adolf Eichmann, who both disregarded and relished the effects of his actions on others because he profoundly believed in what he was doing. At the center of corporate, I want to flip to that. Center of corporate complicity was mundane and myopic dedication to short-term self-interest, whether defined as monetary returns, personal advancement, or individual or corporate survival. As Raoul Hilberg, one of the pioneers of Holocaust studies, observed, in most German organizations throughout the Holocaust, quote, normal procedures were employed as if extreme decisions were not being made, unquote. The main impetus behind this ethical numbness was a relentless focus on oneself and one's own blinkered priorities. So what's the point of this long story? Refusing to defend people as a group can lead to persecuting them as such. Once the haters acquire power and the capacity to mold human self-interest, including firms' self-interests, to their purposes. And once this process gathers momentum, it is far harder to stop than to accept, far harder to reject the justifications than to begin to echo them. The results were catastrophic, especially for Jews, but also for the Germans themselves, but not for most of the big business figures who collaborated with Nazism. True, some of these executives were caught up in the Nuremberg military tribunal proceedings against the leading directors of Flick, Krupp, and IG Farben, Karl Rasche of the Dresdner Bank, Paul Pleiger of the Reichswerke Hermann Göring. These are the pictures of these people. Flick, Krupp, the IG Farben directors, Rasche. This is Paul Pleiger. And there was also a French trial of Hermann Röchling, the man you see the lower part of this image. But both the prosecution and the defense badly distorted the historical record. On the one hand, the prosecutors emphasized claims of a conspiracy between business and the Nazi regime that never really happened, and ignored the opportunism and self-protection that did. On the other hand, the defenses stressed compulsion as an excuse, even though it was far less important than the industrialists' swift acquiescence and adaptation to the Nazi regime's purposes and continuous desire to profit from them. Though convictions outnumbered acquittals, the sentences were generally mild. Only the verdict in the Krupp case got to the heart of corporations' liability, and all of the condemned executives were released by 1951, making the longest time served 6 years. For the next 4 to 5 decades, German industry engaged in a remarkably successful PR campaign, at least within the country, to load responsibility for the crimes of Nazi Germany, especially its exploitative policies in occupied Europe and toward forced and slave labor, onto Nazi fanatics and the German state they controlled, and thus to avoid paying any compensation. Meanwhile, corporations hoarded remarkably extensive archives while blocking research into what actually had happened. Both these dams against reparations and research broke in the aftermath of German unification in 1990, resulting in payments of almost 5 billion euros to the relatively small surviving forced and slave laborers, and to the flood of publications that you see in this picture of a bookcase from my study that made this lecture possible. Thank you all for your attention. I'd be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much. So I think there are few enough of us that if people want to just unmute and ask a question, they can. Or if anyone prefers to just write it in the chat. And the folks there at the library, I'll let you handle if there are folks with questions.
Okay, do you want me to stop sharing my screen or?
Yes. Why don't we do that?
Okay.
And
there we go.
So we have a question here from Matt Evans. Could you talk a little about the role of IBM and the American companies in perpetuating the camp system?
Well, all of the foreign countries, all of the foreign companies in Germany, whether it was America, Switzerland, Sweden, France, England, and so forth, they all conformed to Nazi policy. So they all began removing their Jews very early. They all began taking them off the boards of directors and so forth. They began hiring native-born Germans as executives in their firms to operate, so that by 1938, I think Ford had one American executive left at its operation in Cologne. GM had one until 1940, I think. But they gradually tried to look more and more like they are German companies. Woolworths is another company. Woolworths had something like 50 stores in Germany, some of which were managed by Jews, and they removed them, and they advertised themselves as a German company. There are stories about German POWs who were captured and brought to Texas in the early 1940s, and they discovered at that point that Coca-Cola was an American product. They thought it was a German product because Coca-Cola had, I think, 30 bottling plants in Germany. And one of Coca-Cola's products to this day, is a product that was invented in Nazi Germany in order to substitute for when the war began with the United States. They couldn't get the syrup and the formula from America anymore, so they invented Fanta. And Fanta, the orange drink, is in fact a product of Nazi Germany to substitute for Coca-Cola not being able to sell its original stuff. So all these companies conform, and to the point where in 1940, I'm sorry, 41, the General Motors subsidiary, which is Opel, begins to manufacture plane parts, which is a military good, and they conceal that from the people back in Dearborn, but the people in Dearborn find out, and they basically, and the testimony to Congress is full of all kinds of evasions that we're not really manufacturing military parts because these are only components. They're not really going to the manufacturer. They're going through intermediates and so on. So there's a lot of evasion. Now, but the overall pattern is the same for all countries and all foreigners. They try to keep doing business in Germany as long as they can. The major exception to that is Warner Brothers, the film company. Warner Brothers gets out very quickly because the Jewish manager of the Warner Brothers sales office in I think Frankfurt is beaten up by stormtroopers. And at that point, Jack Warner back in LA says, we're not going to work with these people anymore, and he pulls the office out. But Warner Brothers didn't have a manufacturing facility. It's just a sales operation. And so they're the one conspicuous example of somebody taking a moral stand, but they don't have a whole lot of skin in the game, which these other companies do, and that's what makes them resistant to getting out. Now, the IBM story is different. The IBM had a subsidiary in Germany. It was called Deutscher Höllerit. And the irony of this is that when IBM tabulating machines were invented, they were called Höllerit machines because they were invented by a German who came from this family, who came to the United States, started the company, meanwhile had left the family firm back in Germany. IBM, when it was formed in the early 1920s, led by Thomas Watson, acquired that family firm for a song. Right? Basically, the German inflation had made the mark worthless, and American money snapped up a lot of companies in the early 20s. But he left in charge of the subsidiary the son of the founder. And that guy spent the next 20 years trying to get the company back. When the Nazis came into power, he thought he found his way of doing it. And that if he cozied up to the Nazi regime, they would help him get his independence back from Tom Watson and IBM. You can imagine that Tom Watson and IBM resisted this in every way they could. So what happened there is there's a kind of power struggle to control the German company. Now, the only thing the German company does for the Nazi regime is it conducts the census, tabulates the census of 1939. The most famous book on this subject alleges that the census results were very important to the ability of the Nazi regime to round up Jews. This is factually false. It is not true. The government, the Gestapo, did not use census results in order to locate where Jews were in Germany. The reason is because all German citizens to this day, when they register with the tax offices and when they file their tax returns, they have to indicate what denomination they belong to, because the state transfers 10% of your taxes to the Catholic Church, the Protestant Church, the Jewish community, depending on what you check off on that box. Those taxes records were much more up to date than census records, particularly after 1938, because the Nazis begin rounding up Jews and moving them out of their own property into so-called Jew houses. Within Germany, there were no ghettos, There were individual buildings that became kind of vertical ghettos. Those moves were lost to the census. The census had taken place before those moves occurred, and therefore the tax records were more up to date. So the Gestapo didn't use IBM tabulations and didn't use census records. It used the tax records, which were already available in all the finance offices around. They're decentralized in Germany, and then they also used the Jewish community records, because the Gestapo made the local Jewish councils collect the addresses of all the people who lived in their area and keep those lists up to date. And when the SS started compiling deportation lists, they would send the specifications for the list to the Jewish Council, and the Jewish Council was supposed to send back a list of all the people who fit those specs. And then the deportations occurred. In Eastern Europe, there's no use of census data at all. They just round people up, or they make the Jewish Council in Warsaw collect them. And so they delegate all of this. So what has been said about IBM and the Holocaust is almost entirely legendary. The conduct of American firms in Germany, however, is generally conformist. I'm sorry, that was a long answer.
Very good answer. Very interesting. All right. We have a couple more questions that popped up. Do you see connections to what corporations did in the 1930s to current corporate practice under the current administration?
How can you miss it? I mean, the leverage that the Nazis had on corporations increased greatly during the 1930s, because they create the Nazi economy is no longer a free market economy. It's an economy in which government expenditure drives everything. And that's because Hitler was dedicated from the very beginning of his first big meeting in February 1933 is with the generals of the German army. And he tells them, what we're going to do is make this country capable of war. And we're going to harness the economy to rearmament. And then he realizes that in the course of rearmament, he can't finance that unless he reduces Germany's bills for imports. Germany has very little in the way of raw materials. It has coal, water, wood, earth, and air. Their biggest imported expenses were fuel, rubber, which in those days was only from rubber trees. There were no synthetics yet, and wool and cotton. And he was bound and determined to reduce the expenditures for those things. So he poured money into factories that would make those things out of what he did have. And the Nazis managed to make synthetic gasoline out of coal. They made synthetic rubber out of coal. They made synthetic fibers out of cellulose, which is from trees. And so they poured money into this. And the growth industries of Germany in the 1930s are companies that do this, or that produce military goods. And so the economy becomes skewed toward the war effort. And that means that the way to succeed is to convince the Nazis that you're serving the war effort. Otherwise, you're not going to do very well. Now, the cigarette companies do fine because soldiers smoke. But there's not much in the way that consumer goods can profit from this. By 1938, before the war begins, most consumer goods in Germany are in very short supply. Rationing doesn't really begin. Rationing of labor and steel and raw materials begins in 1936-37. Consumer good rationing starts a little later, except for textiles, which starts early because they want to reserve what they are making for uniforms and things like that. So this is an economy that can be manipulated by government money. And what we're seeing in the present is firms that feel they are vulnerable to not just government money, government regulation, or the way in which regulations can determine how much money you make. Those firms are the ones that are right in line to conform with whatever the current administration wants them to do. And so I think the pattern of behavior is very similar.
Wow, that's scary.
Yeah.
Let's see. Let me ask the library real quickly. Do you have any questions there? We have some others in the chat, but before we move on.
We did actually have one. I was just typing it into the chat. We had an audience member who wanted to know if Bayer, like Bayer Aspirin, that company, was complicit during this time.
Bayer, we're going to turn your mic off again and we're going to get an echo. Bayer and BASF are two still famous companies. They were component parts of IG Farben. They merged into IG Farben in 1925. The third part was called Höchst. It has gone through various mergers since, and you can't recognize who it is now. But Bayer and BASF were both very important. Bayer was predominantly, under the Nazis, a pharmaceutical maker. It was involved heavily with those experiments on prisoners that I mentioned. BASF was the part of IG Farben that pioneered the manufacture of the synthetics, the synthetic fuel, the synthetic rubber, and they were the main BASF factory is at Ludwigshafen in Germany to this day. It was the mother factory for the factory that was built at Auschwitz. So a lot of the personnel that went out there were from BASF. So the answer to your question is yes, they were both very complicit. And these are the ways in which those two stand out.
A question
Thank you.
here. Oh, could you
I just said thank you, that's all.
Okay, thanks. Sorry. Question, what patterns of complicity did you find most surprising across different industries?
You're asking me to think back on how I learned all this stuff over the years. You know, I think the one that was most surprising to me was insurance. Because we all have a vague knowledge about slave labor. And the only thing that I learned about that over all of this time was how pervasive it became. You know, we used to think of, people used to ask me, can you name a big German corporation that wasn't complicit with the Nazis? And I would say, no, I can't. There's nobody. The churches were complicit in using slave labor. So it was really pervasive in the society. But that I just learned how pervasive. That's all. I didn't think how insurance would become so involved with the regime, and how important it was to the Nazis to ensure the factories within concentration camps or next to concentration camps. So that I think is probably what I learned. I learned a lot of chemistry that I didn't know. About what they used people to make and so forth. I remember I told a friend of mine that I had discovered this chemical company I was working on was making large amounts of hydrogen peroxide, and the person looked back at me and said, "Oh, they wanted to dye everybody's hair blonde." And I said, I kind of laughed, but no, you know what the hydrogen peroxide was for? It's a component of rocket fuel. It was used to power V2s. And I had no idea of this. So this is the kind of things that I learned, what forms complicity could take. One of the things you learn about survivors is often that they didn't know who they were working for. And they often didn't know what they were making. They could tell you what they did all day. And I could tell them from what I saw in the documents who they were working for and what they were doing. But their knowledge at the time was very partial.
Let me ask, you talked about some of the lawsuits and reparations of recent years, but so many of these firms are still in existence. And I wonder, like, as consumers, I mean, do you feel like these companies have sort of done penance or sort of cleansed themselves and been honest about their complicity? I'm getting ready to take a trip, and I was looking at Allianz Travel, and then I saw them pop up on your list of companies that were complicit I mean,
Yeah,
that makes me feel a little squeamish, I guess, about.
well, Allianz has come clean, and there's a big history of Allianz that was written by a wonderful American historian named Jerry Feldman. Uh, and it is very thorough, and it doesn't prettify anything. That array of books that I showed you, um, I would say now virtually every, I won't say virtually every, but a substantial majority of the biggest firms in Germany have opened their archives and allowed professional historians not connected to the firm to get in there and to write about it and to tell the story. There are a few major exceptions. The worst offender is Siemens, which has consistently obscured its own history. And they allowed someone to write their history, but the someone was very closely connected to the company. And there is damning stuff in that book, but it's all in the footnotes. It's all buried in, you have to really dig to find it. Most of the others have come clean, and the great exceptions until very recently were family-owned firms. Family-owned companies have the hardest time because they're, after all, talking about what grandpa did. And and in the case of the most famous one that's about to be published in January, it's a company called Henkel. Henkel is headquartered in Düsseldorf. We don't know much about it here, although they do sell home products here. They are in Germany well known because they manufacture the German equivalent of Tide, the biggest detergent in the country. Until recent years, Henkel wouldn't allow anything. I wrote a history of Degussa, which was closely tied to Henkel, and they wouldn't let me in their archive. But now they have finally decided to come clean. And the problem is, of course, it was grandma who was married to an executive, but grandma was the one who owned the company. So it's hard to fess up for some of these people, but they are all beginning to do it. What's a little more mysterious is how much they have paid, each company has paid in restitution into the fund that I talked about, the 5 billion euros, because the payments are all voluntary. If a company wants to contribute, it can. What it contributes is pegged at, I think, less than 1% of its sales in a given year, but they don't have to contribute that. That's the suggested amount. So the payments bear no relation to the crimes. They're just whatever people feel like they want to do. So this is all very rough justice and very delayed.
Yes, and I was going to ask a lot of the questions I was thinking of, you answered by the time you got to the end about the Nuremberg trials and how light the punishment was for anyone involved.
I mean, with IG Farben, there were 2 executives convicted for the use of the slave labor from the Auschwitz camp. And the original sentences were not that light. They were 12 years, I think. Now, American standards for sentences and European standards for sentences are very different. We punish much more heavily than European countries, but by the standards of Europe, 12 years for that was not a light sentence. But they pardoned them and they let them out after basically 6 years since the end of the war, which meant the conviction came down in 1948. So they served 3 years in the conviction, and they got credit for time served while they were on trial, while they were interned and on trial. So,
Okay, here's another question. What lessons should modern multinational corporations draw from the behavior of German firms, especially in relation to authoritarian governments today?
sooner or later it'll come back to haunt you. It may be in the short-term self-interest to work with these people and to capitulate to them. But it'll come back to haunt you at some point or another. And I think to be sure, the time horizons of American executives are much shorter than, in every one of the people I've talked about here was going to spend his life with that company. There was a lot less mobility from firm to firm. some of the, Reemtsma was the head of that company all the way through the Nazi era, 20 years before, 10 years after. So those people had longer time horizons, and it would mean more to them if they had seen what was coming, to know that there would be, their factories would be bombed, there'd be some damage and so on. American corporate executives have much shorter time horizons, and so my answer is not going to daunt them very much, but sooner or later it'll come back to haunt you.
It looks like we have another question from the library audience. Kelly?
Did you hear her?
No.
Okay. Her mic is unmuted, I think. Try again.
What can you say about the company Boehringer Ingelheim? The company's name is Boehringer in Ingelheim, outside of Mainz.
Is this the company that makes Nivea? Is this the cosmetic company?
Well, they make various products, not only beauty products. They make different things. But
Yeah,
it's also chemical and all kinds of stuff.
There is a history. Might want to mute that while I'm answering. There is a history that's been written of them. They don't have much in the way of bad implication. They did try to work with the regime as much as possible. They did not gain prosperity in the same way because they were a consumer-oriented company in those days. They still are. They didn't gain in the way that IG Farben and the steel companies and so forth did. I do recall, but I have to look this up, but I believe the head of that firm in the early 1940s had a Jewish wife, and that this complicated the relationship with the regime and he sort of danced on eggshells. But I'd have to look that up to confirm it. I'm doing that out of my memory. But that's broadly what I know.
Okay.
They also did take over a Jewish-owned cosmetic company in the Netherlands. So they did engage in some profiteering from the expansion.
Okay. We can't hear if there's any follow-up. Y'all are muted.
No, she just said thank you, basically.
Okay, very good. And I see one, maybe this may be the final question in the chat. Of the 42 documented failed attempts to assassinate Hitler, did any of them involve corporate executives or managers? And then kind of connected to that, how did corporate Germany respond to those attempts? Were any companies moved to take different stances towards the Nazi regime as a result of an attempt?
The only one I know that corporate people were remotely involved in was the 1944 attempt, the Stauffenberg. And two executives there were two people who were board members I'm blanking on the company. It was one of the biggest, who were executed in that. There were two other people who were associated with Robert Bosch, the spark plug electronics maker, who were arrested in connection with that attempt. But they got off. They were released. So I know of two executions but they were very much on the periphery of the July 20th attempt to kill Hitler. Those are the only, and then the two arrests, but the people who got away, those are the only ones that I know about where there was implication in an attempt to kill him. There are not very many corporate executives who are in any way involved with the resistance. There just doesn't happen. There are a smattering, but it's an insignificant percentage of the corporate elite.
You know, it's such a dark history and such a difficult topic. I think we look for maybe an Oscar Schindler, you know, or someone
Sure.
who and you mentioned some who lost their lives as a result of criticisms they made, but I guess that you pretty much covered. Those are the ones who spoke out or tried to resist in any way.
Yeah, I mean, Hans Walz, you won't remember this, but I did show his picture earlier. He is a righteous among the nations from Yad Vashem because he did conceal people. And he used his position to help people in the early 1940s. There's a man named Bertolt Beitz who was in the 1940s a very young man. He was probably in his early 30s. He worked for Krupp, but they sent him out to occupied Poland to run an oil rig, an oil field that was one of their subsidiaries. He warned his Jewish laborers that of an impending roundup by the SS and urged them all to go into hiding. And for that reason, he too became a righteous among the nations afterwards. But they are very rare because the difference between them and Oskar Schindler is Oskar Schindler worked for himself. He owned those factories. He wasn't answering to anybody. He wasn't filing reports to some headquarters where somebody could identify a gap or, and hold him responsible. And so they are, people in corporate structures are exceedingly rare as heroic figures. You had to kind of have the feeling that, there wasn't anybody watching you.
Interesting. Yeah, good point. Well, I don't see any more questions, and we are at about the end of our time here. So
We actually have one more question. Can we do one more?
Sure.
We've got to get
Talk
the,
out loud, or do I need the mic?
okay, we have the mic to the right person.
Yeah, so during the Nazi period, it was the Jews that were seen as the vulnerable people, and you made some reference that we might be in a similar age now. Who would be the vulnerable people that you would see that would need to be advocated for in our time?
Well, I mean, at the moment, it's immigrants. And, the Nazis insisted that Jews were immigrants, no matter how long they'd been in the country. They were unassimilable. And more than that, they were mortal enemies of Germans by definition. That's the way Hitler depicted them. They are people who are out to get you. They are your enemies, and you have to get them out from behind German lines, or we will get defeated next time, just as we did in World War I, because he held the Jews and the leftist political parties that he associated with Jews responsible for Germany's defeat in World War I. So, the group right now that would be marginalized is people who can be depicted as not us. And that, at the moment, is immigrants or certain categories of refugees. So those are the people who need protection. Remember, the Nazis start with Jews. They don't stop with Jews. So the list can get longer as time goes on. Who was on the list at the beginning? Jews. Then it becomes, very quickly, it's gypsies. Very quickly, it's gay men. That by 1936, it's gay men. By 1935, it's gypsies. By 1933, it's the handicapped. I mean, they adopt a sterilization law right away when Hitler comes in. And then they begin and then remember, they start gassing people in German mental institutions before they start gassing Jews. So, it's people who are threats to the genetic stock of the country. So I'd say immigrants, but it'll grow.
Very reminiscent of that Martin Niemöller quote about, first they came for the Jews,
Sure.
or I think he says first they came for the communists.
Yep.
But
Yep.
yeah, we need to speak out for those who are most vulnerable, for sure. Wow. Well, very sobering and very helpful talk. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
My pleasure.
Thanks to everyone in the audience who participated or who came. And I know this recording will be used by some of our teachers and others in their classes. So thank you
Great.
for your impact on all of us.
Thank you all. Take care.
Good night.
So will the recording be available?
Thank you, Carolyn.